Rory Stewart. Now, it used to be quite easy to introduce you. I would have said Conservative MP. I can still say former minister. We can say you did try briefly to become Prime Minister. But what are you now?
I have literally no idea what I am. I mean, I was, as Emma says, I was until recently a leadership candidate with a nice group of Conservative members of Parliament who were voting for me and supporting me to be the leader of the Conservative Party. And I thought, well, maybe I won't be the leader. And then Boris was become Prime Minister. So then I thought, okay, I'm not going to be the leader. And now Boris is Prime Minister. I'm not going to be in the cabinet anymore. So I resigned from the cabinet.
Before he could sack you.
Before he could sack me, yep, exactly. And then I have now discovered I'm not an MP anymore. And 18 out of the 21 of us who voted against the no-deal Brexit were people who supported me for the leadership campaign. So it's like a sort of a purge of the Mensheviks in the Russian Revolution. We've all been kind of thrown out. And now I seem to be somebody in a sort of in what looks like an enormous yellow fire risk in the middle of Hampstead.
Well, you've got some military experience, so we're all safe, I'm sure. On a serious note, I asked for some questions on social media this morning for you. Got some brilliant ones, so I'll go to those in just a minute. But have you been invited to rejoin the party that you love and have served? Because apparently a few deals are starting to go down, and I wonder if you've been approached by the Chief Whip, by Boris Johnson's office.
So there are lots of rumours about this, and we got a letter from the Chief Whip, but it wasn't an awfully friendly letter. The answer, to be honest, is that it would be very, very difficult for most of us now to rejoin the party, because if you think about it, imagine you're Ken Clarke. He's the father of the House. He's been in the House of Commons since I guess since the time I was born. And he has been in Edward Heath's government, in Margaret Thatcher's government, in John Major's government, in David Cameron's government. He's been Home Secretary, Chancellor of the Exchequer, Lord Chancellor. He's voted against the government, I think, once in his entire life, and has just found himself thrown out of the Conservative Party. So what exactly would be the route back? And this is what I think the Conservative Party hasn't really thought through. To imagine that they can somehow now say, okay, we'll give you the whip back on the condition you do what, right? Because from our point of view, it's a bit like we've been kicked out of the marital home. We're sitting in the garden shed at the bottom of the garden. And there are different strategies from getting back. One strategy seems to be my friend Philip Hammond's strategy, which is that you sit in the garden shed and you sue the person in the house to let you back in again, right? The other strategy, which seems to be the strategy of Sam Gyimah, which is that you walk out of that garden shed and you move in next door with someone else, right? That's the Lib Dem strategy.
Are you thinking of joining the Lib Dems?
I'm not thinking. I don't like that strategy. I've never liked that strategy. Third strategy, I suppose, is to sit in the garden shed and try to pretend the garden shed is the house. That's kind of the strategy that I'm pursuing at the moment. But the one strategy that doesn't make sense is for the person in the house to say you can come back in provided you publicly humiliate yourself and agree to lock yourself in the bathroom for the next 20 years. Yeah.
So, are you upset, though, about it? On a personal level, as someone who has stood for the Conservatives, how does it actually make you feel? You're obviously able to paint these pictures of how there are strategies, but when you had the whip withdrawn, how did that feel to be sacked?
No, it feels very strange, because I went in to see Boris just before he became leader to say, look, I'm going to resign. You must understand that I can't be in your cabinet because I am against the no-deal Brexit. But I thought the understanding that I had with him was the normal understanding, which is that you can't be in the government if you oppose the main part of government policy. But I still believe very strongly that Parliament could be independent from government, that there wasn't much point having a Parliament if they 100% always do what the Prime Minister says. You might as well get rid of Parliament entirely, that it's a fundamental principle of our Constitution that members of Parliament are able occasionally to vote against government. So it was astonishing to me to discover that really when I thought we'd agreed that what I was giving up is my role as Secretary of State for International Development, that what I was really doing is giving up being a member of parliament at all. And I also think that it's bizarre that our constitution even allows him to do this. You couldn't do this in the United States. President Trump would not be able to deselect you as the Republican candidate for Tennessee. That would not be within his power, right? That would be something that would rest with the local parties. So there are many constitutional issues coming out now. But on the subject that Emma's asking, in terms of my personal emotional reaction, yeah, it's completely bewildering. I mean, this analogy of sitting in the garden shed is correct. I mean, I am going...
Do you feel it's an abuse of power?
Yes, I feel it's an abuse of power, but I think also personally, although there are many times when I feel cheerful and many times when I feel, okay, I'm going to stand up for a different type of politics, obviously at some level, I'm going through the emotional experience of somebody who's just lost their job or has just been kicked out of the house. And that does have an effect on your self-confidence, have an effect on what you're doing. And it raises questions, all these people you've been working with for 9.5 years. Local councillors in my constituency who I've been with through difficult family troubles, who I've campaigned with, now turning against me. Members of Parliament who were my friends, now appearing on television saying that they think it was the right thing that I get fired. So it's a tricky personal time. And one of the challenges, as it were, sitting in that garden shed is we're not necessarily psychologically in exactly the right position to make the decision on what we do next, and that the decision to jump next door or go back into the house or sulk in the shed is being taken at a time of where psychologically we may not be calm enough to see clearly.
One of the things that we know about our new Prime Minister, yet to be elected by the people, is that he doesn't like being disliked. That actually one of his great weaknesses, which is a weakness in a leader, regardless of your view of the leader, is that he really struggles personally with the fact that he is now a Marmite divisive figure since backing Brexit to leave on that side, because he was a very popular figure nationally when he was on things like Have I Got News for You, when he was London Mayor, when he was a journalist. You may not have liked him then either, but he certainly had that feeling about himself, and these are people who've written about working with him say this. I ask you then, do you think it was Boris Johnson who made that decision to purge his party of you guys, who he himself voted against, for instance, Theresa May's deal twice out of 3 times. He went with her once at the end, but he didn't lose the whip. Theresa May didn't do that to people, that cabinet that you sat in and on with Boris Johnson for some time. Or do you think it's the work of an even more unelected official, Dominic Cummings, the mastermind of the Leave EU campaign, the official campaign? Who is it? Is it Boris Johnson that's the puppet master, or is it Dominic doing this?
So I think it's very important to understand that in the end, the buck stops with the person in charge. Now, it may be the case that this is a strategy driven by Dominic, but the Prime Minister appointed Dominic, the Prime Minister supports Dominic, and the Prime Minister signed off on the strategy. And this is something that often happens in regimes. And it actually used to happen traditionally with medieval English kings. The story was always, that the person at the top is fine, it's their advisors that's the problem. If only the king knew the terrible things that their favourites and advisors were doing. And people actually did this over with Nixon and Watergate. There was an enormous focus on their chiefs of staff and the people under them. And I think the sort of simple view, which is that you need to pin responsibility on the elected person at the top, is the correct view. And that although it's tempting to imagine there's some sort of secret Svengali who does the whole thing, you have to acknowledge that the person at the top has empowered that person, given that person the power, and must bear moral responsibility for what that person does.
If the courts find Boris Johnson guilty, essentially, of misleading Her Majesty over the prorogation of Parliament next week, is Boris Johnson's position as Prime Minister of this country untenable?
I don't think his position is untenable. I think the risk, though, is that we get into a form of Trumpian politics. In other words, almost certainly were the courts to find against the Prime Minister, he would, like Donald Trump, just try to shrug it off and say, I don't care about the courts, I've got the people on my side. And we're getting a sense of that already with his approach to prorogation, his approach to purging people, his statements about the fact that despite the fact that Parliament has voted for an extension. He's not going to go to Brussels and request that extension. So what will happen is not that his position becomes untenable, but that British politics will become increasingly divisive and polarized, because he will have doubled down on a tradition which I am also responsible for. So understand this cuts both ways. That I'm obviously criticizing Boris for being unconstitutional, but remember, I also participated in a vote. I voted against No Deal Brexit, and that vote was made possible by the Speaker breaking Constitutional Convention by allowing us to introduce a positive motion on a particular type of special order of the House. So there is a bigger problem happening in British politics, which is when it suits us, far too many of us are trying to break the rules to suit our own position. Let me be provocative to a crowd that is overwhelmingly a Remain crowd.
How do you know that? Do they smell a certain way?
Well,
or?
Please put up your hand if you voted Remain.
It was a good guess.
Okay, so
it's always good to check. A lot of presumption in politics isn't always good.
Absolutely, we have to have some intuitions as politicians, or we can't really operate at all. But with if you look at people's attitude towards the second referendum, you can feel the same thing, which is that for many of us, we are beginning to get into a mindset that the end justifies the means, that we are becoming increasingly determined to ignore process and outcomes we don't like in order to get to what we think is right. And so I think if we're going to challenge what Boris is doing, which is what I want to do, we also have to be quite disciplined with ourselves, and people like me need to be more careful about how I approach the constitution and process, as well as attacking him on the other direction.
I think that's a very interesting point to make, but I particularly asked that question about Boris Johnson's position becoming untenable, not just because it came up on social media, that was one of the questions that came in, but also because people like Sir Ming Campbell, former leader of the Lib Dems, a former Scottish QC, has actually said he has to resign next week because you can't lie to the Queen about your real reasons for suspending Parliament, not least when your Defence Secretary has been overheard saying at an event, well, the real reason we did it was because we need some space and a lack of scrutiny on Brexit. I'm badly paraphrasing Ben Wallace, but that is out there in the public domain, if nothing else. So I just wanted to understand, why do you think somebody like that, who no longer really does have skin in the political game, would say that? And he wasn't saying it in a mischievous way, he was saying it in a very serious way.
So I think, Emma, that in the past, prime ministers almost certainly would have resigned. So, but we're getting into this is why I'm drawing the analogy with Trump.
Yes.
I mean, if you were the editor of the New York Times, you would have felt for the last 2.5 years you had produced a story every week that would inevitably lead to the resignation of the president, and doesn't. So Ming is correct. I think in the past, many of these things would lead to resignation, but I also think that my reading of the strategy that Boris is pursuing is such that he's very, very unlikely to respond to a court case by resigning, because he probably feels that a chunk of the country, I don't know how much chunk of the country, but a chunk of the country will support him, because a chunk of the country will feel, here is this out of touch group of people sitting on the top of a pyramid. I know who they are. They're politicians, they're journalists, they're judges, and they're trying to undermine the will of the people. And if he aligns himself with people against them and portrays the judges as being part of this out of touch conspiracy, he can ride it through.
That's sort of Parliament versus the people, establishment versus the people strategy.
And he is a sort of, I think for many of his voters, he's a sort of hand grenade which is being thrown at that group.
And like a true politician, you didn't quite answer one part of my question. Do you think he should? So not do you think he will, do you think there's arguments either side, but do you personally think the honourable thing to do next week would be to resign in what you know about law, politics and constitution?
Well, I think, in a sense, he's too deep in now. He's steeped too deep in this. Were I in that position, I hope I wouldn't have been in that position in the first place. I think the problem is that all these moves are part of a total strategy, which I've tried to call out from the leadership campaign. I mean, the problem of the thing starts with a fundamental dishonesty. The fundamental dishonesty was, we're going to leave by the 31st of October. Right? He was never going to be able to leave by the 31st of October. That was obvious 4 months ago. How could he possibly? I mean, as I kept saying to him, leadership campaign, you can't get a new deal out of Brussels and you can't get a no deal through Parliament. So how can he leave by the 31st of October?
But they have started to negotiate with him. They're using that word now.
I would, if he got a new deal out of Brussels, took it through and left by the 31st of October, would be the first person to apologise. I'd go down on bended knees in front of him and say, you're absolutely right, I'm completely wrong. So if he pulls off this miracle of getting a new deal out of Brussels and getting that new deal through Parliament by the 31st of October, I'm going to be the first to say, that I'm totally wrong, that it's completely the end of my political project. However, I suspect come the 31st of October, that will not be the case. He will not get a radically new deal out of Brussels and he won't be able to get it through Parliament. So, and I suppose I've been certain enough of this for months now to think that saying that you're going to leave on the 31st of October, do or die, is somewhere between a fairy story and an untruth.
End of your political project. Will you resign fully from politics?
If he gets a deal through by the end of the 31st of October, I think I'm happy to say I wouldn't run again as a Member of Parliament. Yeah.
That is what we call a news line in my line of work. Is there any journalists here? Very interesting indeed. We shall see. One of my favourite things about asking for questions, which I love doing, and especially my main job is on Radio 5 Live every morning. And when I'm interviewing a politician, and Rory's been on a couple of times, some of the best questions come in on the text console as you're doing it. And it's always, Sue, who's listening at home while doing a bit of cooking, or Bob, who's on the road, or whatever's going on, and they just suddenly say it exactly how it is. And this question came in, Rory, from a woman called Janet. Rory Stewart, she said she enjoyed you in the leadership contest, as many did. Obviously, they didn't have a vote. Why haven't you started another parliament across the road, like you said you would, if prorogation had taken place? And okay, so Janet wanted to know.
Okay, so the answer to Janet is that I said that we'd start another parliament across the road if he suspended Parliament in order to prevent us blocking a no-deal Brexit. But what we did, and this is why I've actually been kicked out of the Conservative Party and left the government, is that through the vote in July, we forced him to bring Parliament back in September. And we were able to use that opportunity in September to vote to block a no-deal Brexit. So we've achieved our objectives. So what would this Parliament do during this 5 weeks? Not clear to me. So, and as a result of that, if I were to go across the road and try to hold another Parliament, nobody would turn up because our objective has been achieved, which is to block a no-deal Brexit.
I mean, some people may turn up. There were some politicians who've been trying to go in and sort of sit there and take selfies, but I take the point. I do take that point. I think it's a fair distinction on what you said was the reason for it. If you had won that leadership contest, what would everything look like now? Where would we be?
There'd probably be riots in the streets. So, in the dream optimistic scenario of winning the leadership, I would hope that what I would have done is decisively moved the Conservative Party to become a party of the centre ground, of the radical centre. I wanted very much to find a compromise. I was very excited by the idea of a citizens' assembly, which is getting a group of people, about the number of people in this tent, but selected randomly, scientifically across the country together to sit and spend 3 weeks in public talking through the details of Brexit and working their way towards a compromise. I wanted to get 2 million houses built, and built quickly within a 5-year period. I wanted to address adult social care in a cross-party way. I mean, it seems to me that is one of the real miseries, is that the NHS was a great achievement, but for 70 years we've thought about how to deal with people who are ill, but we've not come up with a solution to the frail elderly. Green papers, white papers, but nobody's been prepared to work cross-party on this. So those, I think, would have been the things that I hope that you would have felt. And I'd hope the process would have been a process of healing, of trying to bring the country together towards the centre ground.
And that small issue of Brexit, what would be happening with that right now?
So we'd be going through the Citizens' Assembly, and we would have been working our way to what I believe would have been an outcome of a compromise. In other words,
so you would have had the time to get the ideas from the Citizens' Assembly, to get to Brussels, to get something back to Parliament, or do you think we would have had to have extended a little?
Oh, we would have had to extend, yeah.
Okay.
We would have had to extend. I never had this 31st October deadline in my head. Yeah.
Have you read David Cameron's book yet?
No.
You in it?
I don't know. I haven't looked at it.
Thought that's what you politicians do when each other writes book. You go straight to the index.
It's true. It's true. Paddy Ashdown once gave me a copy of his book, and I couldn't. There was no dedication in it. And then I flipped to the S in the index, and he'd written above it, "I knew you'd look here first. Love, Paddy." Yeah.
I've written a book about periods, and if you want to talk about periods, politics and power, I'll be here at 3:00. I suspect the crowd may be smaller, may not be. You're not in it. I just thought I'd clarify that. But I did get asked, would Rory happily sit on the tube and read a book about periods? I think you would, wouldn't you?
I'd definitely do that.
He's got to say that.
do,
Yes.
I do that.
Right. I ask about David Cameron's memoirs because it's very interesting what he's been saying about the Queen. Her Majesty's in the news a lot at the moment due to former Etonians. And not listing you in that, actually, David Cameron and Boris Johnson, in terms of whether Boris has misled, whether David has misspoken. Was David Cameron right to ask for the Queen even just to raise an eyebrow in the run-up to that Scottish referendum?
He was wrong, and he was 1,000 times wrong if he did that, to then say that he'd done that.
You're not meant to find that bit out, are you, in politics?
It's
The sort of internal wiring.
Totally insane. I mean, if he actually had that conversation with the Queen, and the Queen had been prepared to do that, it is the most astonishing betrayal of that conversation to put that down in writing.
What's wrong with David Cameron when it comes to... There's a next bit, sorry. But when it comes to discretion over the monarch, he's not got it, has he? Where he once said she purred down the phone to me, which made our monarch sound sexual.
I think he likes insider gossip. He thinks that one of the charming ways of dealing with a crowd is to sort of let you into the secret of his glamorous life. So he often in speeches will have a little anecdote about, this moment he shared with Angela Merkel, or this funny thing that he did with Berlusconi. I mean, he
Wow, that would be a good one.
Yeah.
What did he do with Berlusconi?
Well, his great gag was that the one thing that he learnt in politics, and he'd say this again and again in meetings, is if Berlusconi invites you to a party, never go. If the Queen invites you to a party, always go. But this is part of.
He's not going to be invited to any more by the Queen. Sorry.
No. But you're right. But I think this is part of the collapse of seriousness in politics. You don't actually want your leaders trying to take you into cozy little moments with Angela Merkel or the Queen, right? There has to be discretion and seriousness at the base of this. What you actually want us talking about, if possible, is how to bring this country together and make it a better place, not, bringing you along with me in my glamorous little life.
So David Cameron's contributed to a lack of seriousness in politics.
I think our entire political system, including David Cameron, has got into a deeply, deeply unserious space. I think if you wanted a way of really criticizing Britain, you would say we are in danger of not being a serious country anymore. The policy conversations are not serious. Our approach to Brexit has not been serious. Our approach to our constitution is not serious. Our approach to foreign policy is not serious. This is a serious country full of some very serious, smart people. And we are so much less than the sum of our parts. We are not being who we should be. And that's about leadership, but it's also about a public that enables leaders to behave in a non-serious fashion.
In a moment, I'm going to hand you over to this crowd, not literally for some questions. I do have some non-serious questions, which now sort of feels wrong after what you just said. They are from a couple of other people online who wanted to know that one of the women who got in touch had read your favourite books in the Week magazine, excuse me. Middlemarch is in there, I believe. She was a bit worried that you don't have enough of a laugh in your life because of your very serious choices. But what makes you laugh, Rory Stewart?
That's a really good question. Fleabag. Fleabag makes me laugh.
Good choice. All right. And another one, who would play you in a film?
I have the answer to this. I've been dreaming of it since I was very young. I am going to be played by Danny DeVito.
You may have to lose a little weight, just a little. Could we please have some of your wonderful questions? Straight up, brilliant.
The venality of both of the major parties over this Brexit issue shows a moral bankruptcy that I think both of them are going to have a hard time recovering from. What's your vision of the political system in, say, assuming we can get past this in 10 years' time? Do you see it as an ever-increasing polarization between these two rabid tribes, or do you see some new forms emerging?
Okay, it's a really good question. So I think that there is a very strong logic towards polarization. So essentially British public opinion, which used to be a sort of bell jar with all the votes in the middle, has now become a U-shape with all the votes on the extremes and nobody left in the center, at least so it feels, right? But we have to, I think, advocate for the center ground. I mean, my whole project now is to say these parties are finished, ultimately. That way of approaching politics cannot be sustained. That there has to be a complete reshaping of our political life, and that it must be possible to make the arguments for the center ground. But to make those arguments, we need to be prepared to use things like this. In other words, we need to be Trumpian anti-Trumps. We need to learn how to make quite populist-sounding arguments for non-populist causes. We need to resist the temptation to become sort of boring technocrats. I mean, that's the danger of my saying we need to be serious. Find a lively, engaged way of listening and engaging. And I think the word that was most powerful in my campaign probably had the real energy, but is very difficult to learn as a politician, is the word love. Because I think that's a word which is very, very radical, full of courage, full of possibility, but is in the end about empathy and bringing people together rather than dividing them.
Can the microphone, there's a hand just there. I hope that's not too hard to get to.
Thanks very much. Just a very quick one. If you believe the centre ground of politics is where people really should be, why wouldn't you join the Liberal Democrats? They're really setting themselves up as being against authoritarianism, so against extremism, and in favour of liberal values.
So I think the thing that's shocked me most about the Lib Dems and the reason that I wouldn't join them is this announcement that they're going to revoke without a second referendum. I think that is insane. I think for a programme that began for Brexit voters as here is these people at the top of the pyramid completely out of touch, the elite just ignore us, they're not interested in our views, to then say, we're going to just remain, and we're not even going to ask you again, we're going to completely ignore the result of the referendum because you don't know what's good for you, I think is totally playing into that rhetoric, and I think it's deeply, deeply dangerous. If you're going to go for Remain, you've got to have a second referendum, and I think, actually, for a party that claims to be anti-authoritarian, that is a very authoritarian move.
Okay. Rory, why no mention of Northern Ireland and the border there?
Okay, let me finish on this, because that's a very, very good challenge and a very good thing to end on. In talking about why Britain is not a serious country, one of the biggest elements of that is how little we talk about Ireland. And Northern Ireland is part of our country, and yet often, if you read British media or hear politicians over the last 5 years, they talk about it as though it's located somewhere near Sarajevo, right? It's not really part of our political discourse. And of course, the fundamental problem with Brexit from the beginning was the issue of Ireland, and yet the Remain campaign almost never talked about Ireland. Go to Derry, Londonderry at the moment, and you are aware of the fact that the peace there is very recent and very fragile. Those Apprentice Day marches are things that still have to be taken through with the most extraordinary care. You will see peace walls still up. You will see there's a Protestant community living in the middle of Derry, Londonderry that is quite literally surrounded by 15-foot walls with parachute regiment flags up. You go over those walls and you'll see big, big images of Che Guevara. This Good Friday Agreement was, in the end, facilitated by the removal of that border. It allowed people to live in Northern Ireland and feel Irish, or live in Northern Ireland and feel British without having to confront the question of which they were. And the economy of Northern Ireland is deeply integrated into the Republic. 85% of the sheep from Enniskillen go across the border to abattoirs in the Republic. It's a single island health economy. So amongst the many, many reasons to be very worried about a no-deal Brexit, Ireland, and indeed I think for me as a Scot, the consequences for Scotland and the United Kingdom are some of the deepest reasons why I think a no-deal Brexit would be deeply damaging, deeply unnecessary, and something we would regret for years to come.
Thank you for that question. I'd like to thank my guest, Rory Stewart, for his canvas.
For more debates, talks and interviews, subscribe today to the Institute of Art and Ideas at IAI TV.